Okay. I want to express my thanks to Carl because just about 2 months ago, I found out that I was responsible for today's speaker as well as next month's speakers. So he was able, just with 2 months advance notice, to fit us into his extremely busy schedule at the World Resource Institute. So just a little bit about my brother. My kid brother, Carl, has lived and breathed environmentalism since his first date in 8th grade. He took a girl in his class to an Earth Day event, April 22nd, 1970. I don't know if he got a hug, but he's been hugging trees ever since. Maybe. He went on to Cornell, got a BA in economics, and went to the University of Berkeley, California, and got his PhD in public policy, I believe in 1981. He's been working in and around Washington ever since on environmental matters. Most recently, of course, as it becomes more and more dire, the climate change issue. He has worked for the Senate Energy Committee, reporting to Senator Johnston of Louisiana. He worked for the Environmental Protection Agency briefly, and at one point founded his own NGO with a colleague concerning climate issues. And he's been with the World Resources Institute now for a number of years. And he's going to talk to us about the possibility of reaching carbon dioxide minimum or zero levels by the year 2050. So this is my kid brother, Carl. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Eric, although I'd prefer that you do not drag up the failed love life of my junior high and high school years. Let's see, I am trying to start my slideshow, and is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Great. Okay, as Eric said, I'm going to talk about can the U.S. get to net zero emissions? And also on part of that is to talk about what are truly the visionary climate provisions of a law enacted in August, the Inflation Reduction Act, sort of strangely named. It's probably not going to do a whole lot for inflation, frankly, but maybe we can nickname it the Temperature Reduction Act if its provisions play out on that in that area. So here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk about, what does it mean for a country or a globe to hit net zero emissions? How do we think about that? I'll give a brief history of U.S. climate policy, and I should say I'm sort of a card-carrying, flaming centrist Democrat. I'm going to talk about that history with reference to positions of both the Democrat and Republican parties over the years, but I'm sure we have both Democrats and Republicans in the room, so I don't want to offend anyone. Then I'll talk about the 4 key strategies needed to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions, and with also talking a little bit about the other greenhouse gases. Then I'll turn to an overview of the IRA's climate provisions, and I hope I can convince you that they're pretty revolutionary and visionary. We can take then a little Q&A break there about halfway through, and then I would turn to a deep dive on 2 issues that are really controversial in how we get to net zero, in my view. One is, how do we decarbonize the production of electricity? Asking the question, why or why not should we go for 100% renewable electricity? The second deep dive I'll do is on something called carbon capture, where you either prevent CO2 from being emitted into the air, you capture it, you stick it underground, or you literally capture it literally out of the air after it's emitted. And most people view this as a solution, as part of the solution to this problem. Other people say we shouldn't go down that road at all. Finally, I'll summarize some key takeaways. I'm going to present my views, but also some dissenting views. My views are very mainstream in terms of what the conclusions of our National Academy of Sciences, the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but I'll highlight dissenting views. I'll share my deck with you when we're done. You can see web links throughout if you want to go do your own deeper dives on these issues. And I'll move through this fairly quickly, but we'll have time for Q&A. So what does it mean for a country or a globe to have net? What do we mean by net emissions, and what does it mean to get to net zero? You can probably imagine the emissions from different sectors of the economy. This is a graph that has U.S. emissions in millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, meaning both carbon dioxide and then other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and some trace industrial gases. And then this is how it has changed over time from 1990 to 2020. And you can see probably categories that will look intuitive and familiar here: residential emissions from our buildings, commercial, agricultural emissions, emissions from industry, emissions from electricity generation, from transportation. That's all pretty straightforward, and those total up in 2020 to about 6,000 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The other piece of the accounting of greenhouse gases is what are negative emissions. And for the US, what we call land use change, and forestry is actually a category where we're pulling CO2 out of the air because in general, our forests are growing and expanding. And so experts estimate that we're pulling out about 800 million tons of CO2 because of our expanding forests each year. So that takes us to a net, 6,000 minus 800, about 5,200 million tons. So in some countries, particularly developing countries, if they're still clearing a lot of forests or certain agricultural techniques, this will not be negative. This will actually be positive, adding CO2, cutting, burning forests. But in most developed countries, it's actually a negative. So the idea is if we're going to slow down and eventually stop the further warming of the globe, we're going to have to take these emissions at the national level and at the global level down to net zero, where whatever we're still emitting is balanced out by means of taking some CO2 out of the air. So we'll need drastic cuts in emissions, and then we'll also have to continue to take CO2 out of the air through forests and ag techniques, but also increasingly through technological means, where we literally pull the CO2 out of the air and store it permanently underground. So that's the goal. How do we get to net zero? Let me turn now to a brief history of major U.S. climate policy or attempts at policy. And it's important here to understand this visionary law that passed in August is to distinguish sticks versus carrots. And I hope you appreciate my cartoon here. Stick policies are what we normally think of as, regulations on your car or your factory or your light bulb, or a tax on carbon, a tax on gasoline, or a cap. You've heard of like cap and trade policies, the regional greenhouse gas initiative, or California's cap and trade policy, or the European Union's cap and trade policy. Those are all sticks, forcing changes in behavior either through taxes or sort of direct controls. Carrot policies are tax incentives to do something, a rebate on that light bulb, a rebate on that energy efficient car, or federal procurement buying green energy, or grants or loan guarantees, et cetera, et cetera. Those are carrot policies to try to move toward cleaner energy, less CO2 intensive economic activity. So it's kind of interesting history here at the federal level. In 1993, many of you might recall that the Clinton administration and the Democrats in Congress tried to pass a BTU tax. And that was not directly aimed at climate change, but it was kind of a precursor of maybe a carbon tax, an attempt to decrease the use of fossil fuels. Interestingly, it passed in the House, barely. It died in the Senate, and then several Congress people lost their midterm election in 1994, in part because of their support for the BTU tax. Flash forward about 4 years, and the Clinton administration was in Kyoto, Japan, and supported the Kyoto Protocol, which envisioned a cap and trade system to control international emissions, where inside country borders and between countries, they could trade emissions under a cap. Well, they negotiated this, but it was never even offered to the Senate because there were simply not the votes there. Flash forward about 12 years, under the Obama administration, the president and the Democrats supported something called the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill, a cap on all nearly all greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. Once again, it passed barely in the House. It died in the Senate, and several congressmen lost their 2010 re-election bids in part because of their support for the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. Is anybody starting to see a pattern here? Yes. Then we come to 2022, and we have a new president, Joe Biden. We have slim Democratic control of the House and the Senate, and there was no attempt to pass a major sticks policy for climate change, but instead this sort of amazing bill that sort of came out of nowhere, so to speak. No one expected it to suddenly be able to pass the Senate and House, was almost 99% carrot policies. These are tax incentives, loans, federal procurement, various grants, with projected spending levels of about $369 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And as you may recall, this barely passed the House with all Democrats supporting, all Republicans voting against. And in the Senate, the vote was 50-50, with the vice president breaking the tie. That's how we got a major climate law in place, and reflects the continuing, extreme disagreement over, I think, even the science of climate, and certainly what to do about it between our two major political parties. Interestingly, when you couple this law with the infrastructure bill passed in November 2021, and with a little-known bill called the CHIPS and Science Act, also passed with bipartisan support, these three laws together form a very comprehensive research, development, demonstration, and deployment program that I think really puts us on a good path over the next 10 plus years to deploy commercial technologies, as well as bring more out of the lab. And we certainly need some technology innovation here to solve this problem. I should note there are some existing sticks policies that have been in place for years. We've had appliance efficiency standards, long history. They've been rarely weakened. We've had CAFE standards for our cars. We've had also vehicle emission standards for greenhouse gases. Lots of flip-flops on those regulations, from Obama to Trump to Biden. Similarly, power plant standards limiting carbon dioxide emissions, flip-flops between those same three administrations. I'm happy to say, as far as a stick policy, one of the important non-CO2 gases is something called HFCs, and happy to report that we passed a law in 2020 that phases those down, and we, with bipartisan support, ratified an amendment to the Montreal Protocol just last September. So that's again showing some signs that there is some bipartisan support to solve this problem. We've had cap and trade at the subnational level, as I mentioned. We've had state renewable portfolio standards that require utilities to buy certain amounts of renewable energy, combined actually with carrot policies, federal tax incentives, for many years. So we've been making progress in small ways with stick policies. Now we have a bunch of carrots. I should also note it's very important in this whole arena to note that we have abundant, low-cost natural gas because of the fracking revolution. No matter how you might feel about fracking, it is a fact that its abundance and low cost over the last 10 years have allowed us to phase down a lot of coal generation and replace it with natural gas generation, producing less CO2, as well as replacing some of that generation with renewables. So with that background, let me now turn to the 4 key strategies on how we get to net zero CO2 emissions, and then you'll see how the Inflation Reduction Act maps to these 4 strategies. I want to start with this second set of bars. And again, what I'm saying is very consistent across all sorts of credible studies on how we get there. The first thing we need to do to take CO2 emissions to net zero is be as energy efficient as possible across all sectors of the economy. Right now, we consume about 200 gigajoules per person annually in the US, and we know that with demonstrated technologies, we could cut that by about 1/3 by 2050. Second thing we need to do in this set of bars is electrify as many end uses in the economy as possible. That means substituting the direct use of electricity for the combustion of fossil fuels. Right now, about 20% of our end uses is using electricity directly. By 2050, we could pump that up to near 60% with both electricity and what's labeled here electric fuels, meaning things like producing hydrogen or ammonia and as a non-CO2 fuel. What does electrification mean? Some of it's very simple. It means moving from gas water heaters to 100% electric water heaters. It means moving from gas and fuel oil to heat our buildings to electric heat pumps. It means, of course, the revolution in electric cars that is underway, and also applications in industry where we could use electricity directly instead of burning natural gas or some other fuel. The next step, not surprisingly, is we're going to use a whole lot more electricity in the future to solve this problem. So we need to really decarbonize the production of electricity. Right now, we emit about 500 grams for every kilowatt hour we produce, 500 grams of CO2. We can take that down to near zero over the next 30 years. We have solar, we have wind, we have hydro. None of those produce CO2. We have geothermal, we have nuclear, already holding at about 20% of our total generation, a very important piece of the puzzle. And we can also produce electricity from fossil fuels if we capture the CO2 before it's emitted. The final strategy is called captured carbon. We do very little of it now, but we need to really ramp up these technologies. And I'll come back to this later, but as I said, it's partly capturing CO2 before it's emitted by a power plant or an industrial facility, or it's pulling CO2 literally out of the air. And we'll probably need to do that on the scale of at least 800 million tons by 2050. And again, I never want you to forget that CO2 is 80% of the problem. Methane, nitrous oxide, trace industrial gases are another 20% of the problem. So how does the new provisions of this law map to these 4 strategies? We have lots of tax credits for energy efficiency, that first building block. We have investments in low carbon materials and buildings. And you as homeowners can get new generous tax incentives for insulation, better windows, better doors. Second pillar, electrification of end uses. As a driver, you can now get very generous tax credits for electric vehicles, also available for the commercial sector. There's various grant programs for clean heavy-duty vehicles, including electric school buses. Tax credits. Hey, the next time you need to change out your heating or your stove, you'll have tax credits for heat pumps and electric stoves. Industry has new generous tax credits for producing hydrogen, which is a zero carbon fuel. That third pillar of decarbonization, electricity, we have a really interesting shift in policy where by 2025, instead of just subsidizing renewables, we'll subsidize through the Clean Electricity Production Tax Credit all new zero carbon electricity sources. Very interesting development. We also have a new production tax credit for the existing nuclear power plants to keep them running. As you know, they've been under a lot of pressure, and some of them have been shutting down. Hopefully this will keep that important source of zero carbon electricity online. The bill also promotes offshore wind versus varied leasing policies, grants to facilitate the construction of new transmission lines. We're going to need a lot of those as we electrify the economy and bring in offshore, onshore sources, et cetera, et cetera. And that fourth pillar, carbon capture, we've enhanced various tax credits that spur carbon capture. We have investments in biomass, forestry management that assist that pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere through growing our forests, and also through funding various ag programs that help store carbon in the soil. So those are the four key strategies. But what's really visionary about this bill is that in various ways it aims not just at climate, but aims to enhance U.S. jobs, U.S. wage levels, equity issues, and environmental justice. And it does these through cross-cutting provisions. All of those tax credits I just mentioned across energy efficiency and electrification and zero carbon electricity have bonus provisions. So you as a business get more bonuses for meeting prevailing wage levels, for setting up apprentice programs that encourage job growth, for meeting domestic content requirements. There's also an advanced manufacturing production tax credit to spur more manufacturing here at home. There's bonuses for projects that are located in communities that are losing their fossil fuel production. They just call these energy communities. Let's make sure we locate some of these clean energy projects, in places in West Virginia or Ohio where production is going down. Also low-income communities. Let's produce jobs where people need it the most. Series of environmental justice grants, and a series of what's called direct pay or transferability of these tax credits that expands the kind of entities that can take advantage. Instead of just being a business with tax liability, you can also be a nonprofit or a rural electric co-op that takes full advantage. There's some modeling of the job impacts that looks pretty encouraging here. There's some links if you want to look into that. And interesting, there is a stick policy in here on methane, a tax on or a fee on methane emissions targeted to trying to get the oil and gas industry to reduce the leakage of methane from their facilities. But I want to turn to one really important, none of this is just self-implementing. A series of carrots means that we have to actually respond as residents and businesses and et cetera. We put the carrots in place, but can we build all this stuff? And here's a great quote from a climate hawk, Senator Schatz of Hawaii. He said recently, the environmental movement of the last generation was partly organized around stopping things. That's a lot of what we were trying to do back in the 70s, right? With the initial environmental laws. But to save the planet, we are going to have to build things at an unprecedented speed and scale. We need to make it easier, not harder, to build big planet-saving projects. And a lot of these big planet-saving projects run into permitting and siting problems, NIMBY problems. And I don't have time to go into this right now, but I will give you 3 sources if you want to dig into it. Ezra Klein at the New York Times has done some great columns and podcasts on this. The Aspen Institute did a good report on building cleaner faster. The Niskanen Center and the Clean Air Task Force teamed up on a good report saying, how are we going to build all that clean energy infrastructure? All of these studies, all these experts point to the need to streamline permitting and siting reform to get this stuff built. Yes, we still need to pay attention to local impacts, But if everybody in the country says, not in my backyard, playing the NIMBY card, we're never going to get any of this stuff built. We're not going to get the CO2 reductions we need. And those reductions we need, interestingly, here's a graph of just our emissions from 2005 to 2030 are tracking down from about 6,500 million tons down to current levels, as I said earlier, about 5,200. We have a goal of getting our emissions about 50% below our 2005 levels by 2030 on the road to net zero by 2050. And in the orange here, we have some expert projections of how the Inflation Reduction Act can take us, getting closer and closer to that level. But that's only going to happen if we actually take advantage of all these carrots across the economy. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and take some questions before moving on to two really tough controversial issues. So I think we have a moderator.
Hey, Alan, you have a question? Please come up here.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Carl. That was very interesting. 45 years ago, I started my career with a company building nuclear power plants. After a year, I got laid off, which is a good thing, though. I went to Alaska to help build an oil pipeline across the state so that we could burn more fossil fuels. So my question has to do with nuclear power plants. These are ultimately a big solution. If you're talking about generating 800 or 900 megawatts of power and not generate little or no CO2, nuclear power plant's the way to go. China is looking into putting small nuclear power plants adjacent to medium-sized city, using the power and the waste heat. So what's your opinion about those two, including putting little nuclear power plants at the outskirts of some of these towns in the US?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Bill. I actually going to do a deep dive related to nuclear in the second half of the presentation. I happen to fully support the use of our existing reactors and the expansion of nuclear power as part of the solution. And I think if we can develop the small modular reactors that you describe and with their inherent safety features, and if we can get public acceptability, you could actually have them relatively near population centers and take advantage of the waste heat they throw off in the way that you describe. We're not there yet, but it's very promising, and I'll do a little deeper dive on that in the second half.
Online?
Bill Tittle? Carl, thank you very much. Very interesting and professional presentation. You haven't mentioned solar yet. I don't know whether you plan to do that later, but what do you think of solar as a component of this?
Yeah,
task?
I mentioned solar as one of the key zero carbon sources that we need to decarbonize electricity. And I will, you know, I'm always just saying, listen to the second half here.
Okay.
One of the issues I'm going to go into is, can we build a full renewable electric grid with lots of solar, or do we hit obstacles? But solar is going to be key. We have to put the pedal to the metal on every source of zero carbon electricity.
Thank you.
So let's take one more question from the audience. Gentleman in the back.
Mono. Yes, the question is that you are presenting this as a scientist and all the things that could be done as a scientist, but you're also fighting politics, as you mentioned, and also the CEOs who have to make more and more money for their people who are buying their stocks and things like that. How strong, to me, it seems, as a novice, it seems very strong that that's going to be a hard thing to beat, because everybody wants to make more money on the stock market and everything else for their company. The oil companies don't want to give up their business. So how do you fight those kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Well, the interesting dynamic here is many businesses fought all of those stick policies that have been proposed over the years, but they did not fight the carrots. And the carrots, there was a lot of thought and research put into the levels of these tax incentives. And if the analysis is right, this will allow many of these investments now to pencil out as economic. And I sure hope that's the case. And of course, there's no free lunch here. What this bill did was increase the corporate minimum tax, I think, to 15%, not sure. This was a large tax increase spread across and hitting corporations that were paying very little tax. And then that money was used in a variety of ways, a little bit for deficit reduction. I forget the exact amount. And then again, this 369 billion projected for these. There was some money for some other things as well. I think some shoring up some healthcare. So there's no free lunch. This was a tax increase across the board on minimum corporate tax, and then a creation of tax incentives to solve a very serious problem. So it's changed the dynamic a little bit, but your point is correct. There are still going to be industries that will fight certain things. I am happy to say that roughly over the last 5 years, I have perceived a change in attitude in a lot of corporate boardrooms. They get it, that this climate change is really happening. We are already seeing the damages now. The damages are going to get worse, and it's time for us to roll up our sleeves, not only in this country, but again, working across the globe, so we don't pass on a decimated, way overheated, damaged climate to our children and grandchildren. So we can come back to that more later. So let me turn back to the presentation. Let's see. Okay, so we're now going to do a deep dive on two issues: how to get to clean electricity and whether and how to do carbon capture. If you think of those four big strategies I talked about, I would argue that there's very little debate or controversy over being more energy efficient or electrifying a lot of our end uses. You don't get big debates over that. However, you do get debates and controversy over how to decarbonize electricity production. Some people oppose nuclear power. Some people oppose the idea of putting carbon capture and storage of CO2 on a power plant. Then on that fourth strategy of carbon capture more broadly, using it across power sector and industry, or even capturing it out of the air with technical means, that's also controversial. So let's dive into both of these, starting with electricity generation. You probably know and perceive that there are groups and advocates who are saying we can do all of this with 100% renewables. It's possible. You have businesses linked together saying we can do this. You have mayors saying we're going to only buy renewable energy. And you even have over here Budweiser hawking its beer by saying it's produced with 100% renewables. Ever since they did that, I drink nothing but Budweiser, even though I hate the taste. No, seriously. Renewables have come down tremendously in cost, and there are reasons to be bullish on renewables. This chart is from the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, giving some cost trends over the last 20 years for solar photovoltaics, for wind power, and for concentrated solar thermal generation. And the really great news is that PV solar has come down just the last 10 years, 85%, down to $50 a megawatt or below. Onshore wind keeps tracking downward. Offshore wind, we're innovating there and bringing the cost down of that. And concentrated solar power, same. it's now arguable that, as the IPCC says, that these technologies can compete with fossil fuels in many places, indicated by the gray shading here. It's always important to realize, though, that we are producing electricity here, not energy. Energy is a very broad term: solid fuel, liquid fuel, gaseous fuel, electricity, what have you. We just got to remember, this is electricity, which is good. It's not energy in the broad sense. So yeah, there's reasonable reasons to be bullish. But why? So does this mean that renewable electricity is now so cheap we can just go 100% renewable grids? When you look at the trade press and even the mainstream press, you'll see headlines that list renewables are winning the battle. Solar and wind costs are so low, they're cheaper than existing coal and nuclear plants. Just their operating costs. Pretty soon, solar plants are going to be cheaper than natural gas everywhere by 2023. There's one concept I would love the general public to have a deeper understanding of, is that these claims are made using a metric called LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, which really means the levelized, often people say levelized cost of energy. LCOE is why renewable advocates say we are the cheapest now, we don't need anything else. Well, it's really interesting. I said earlier, the IRA takes a technology neutral approach. The current renewable tax credits will sunset in 2024. They'll be replaced by a technology neutral tax credits for all zero carbon electricity. And we have also the provision for existing nuclear plants. Why did we do this? Why did the Senate and the House in their wisdom go for supporting all forms? Why not? If renewables are cheapest, why not 100% renewable grid? Well, I'm going to make a basketball analogy here. If your top scorer is your shooting guard, why not hire 4 more shooting guards? Renewables are so cheap. Well, there's a reason. And the concept I want you to focus on is system costs, not LCOE. LCOE is the average cost of a megawatt hour from a standalone power plant. In other words, if I just focused on Steph Curry's shooting guard stats, that would not get me a winning basketball team. If I just look at the average cost of a solar or wind plant all by itself, that's not going to get me a winning grid. The system cost is the average cost of the entire system, including all plants and all the technologies needed to maintain a reliable grid, which in basketball is the focusing on your winning team composition. You need a center, you need somebody to rebound, you need somebody to play defense, you need a point guard to feed the shooting guard. And what I want to put to you is that all credible modeling indicates that as a power system approaches 100% wind and solar, the system costs increases sharply and reliability will be harder to maintain. This is widely accepted across, again, IPCC, International Energy Agency, credible US modeling. And what they show is we could get to 60, 70, 80, maybe even 90% wind and solar by 2050, but not 100%. And this is also reflected that nearly all states that have set a goal for zero carbon for the utilities, they define it in terms of clean electricity, not 100% renewable electricity. Also, the Biden administration, they set a goal for 2035 of 100% clean, all technologies, not renewable. So it's a very misused metric to just say, oh, solar and wind are cheap because the cost of a standalone plant shows are so low. If you don't believe me, I would point you to an amazing study from last year by 16 authors from our National Renewable Energy Lab. These are people who spent their whole careers promoting solar and wind and other renewable energy sources, but they're realists, they're good analysts. And they concluded significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% renewable at national scale for all hours of the year. There is no simple answer to how far we can increase renewable penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. And why is this? As I'm sure you all know, wind and solar are intermittent. or variable sources. We lose 100% of our solar output every night, and we lose it sometimes during cloudy days. Wind has a sort of a weird seasonal, daily, monthly pattern. You don't turn it on and off. So a grid operator must integrate these sources in ways that keep the lights on 24/7. Integration costs include the transmission costs of linking together more solar and wind over broad geographic areas to collectively reduce the intermittency. It means storage, whether it's batteries or pump storage, or it means we're still trying to bring out of the lab. It means demand management costs, moving our demand from nighttime into the day when solar is abundant, or sometimes just overbuilding plants. We lose our solar production is a lot less in the winter than the summer. Duh, it's physics. The sun is farther away and hitting us at a different angle. So a heavy solar system would have to overbuild to make sure we have enough power in the winter, and then we'd have too much in the summer. So all these costs are not included in the LCOE calculation. All of them tend to escalate as renewable energy grows. That's why we need all technologies. I'll just let you look at this on the slide deck. There are dissenting views. There's, world experts like Mark Jacobson of Stanford that says, we can do this 100% renewables. I respectively disagree. These are clearly minority viewpoints. A final note on electricity decarbonization. I like to ask the question, what are governments, not modelers and analysts, actually planning to do? This gets back to an observation that I think Bill made in his question. Well, my institute looked at the long-term strategies for 2050 submitted to the climate treaty, laying out government's visions on how they're going to reduce emissions. Of the first 29 we looked at, first of all, 18 countries indicated that they were going to use carbon capture. 16 countries planned they were going to use nuclear generation. One country's under consideration. And if we zoom in on the larger economies, 5 out of the 7 G7 countries have nuclear in their long-term strategies. US, UK, France, Japan, Canada. When we look at the G20 countries, 9 of them have nuclear in their long-term strategies, including China. 5 of the G20 countries that haven't submitted a long-term strategy have nuclear plants under construction or planned. Argentina, Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey. These countries are not giving up nuclear or carbon capture to go with 100% renewables. This is what's happening in the real world, and we need to be aware of that. Let me turn to the second deep dive on carbon capture. The Inflation Reduction Act bumped up tax incentives. You can get $60 a ton for every ton of CO2 you capture instead of putting it in the atmosphere and utilizing it in some industrial process, or for enhanced oil recovery. You can get 85 a ton, capture it, stick it underground in a secure geologic formation. And you can get $180 a ton if you capture it directly out of the air to reduce concentrations, pipe it underground, and store it. Why? Why are we throwing money at carbon capture? Well, let's look at what the IPCC scientific assessment says about how the heck we can keep warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees over this century. This graph shows global emissions. Global emissions of just CO2, in this case, not the non-CO2 emissions, from 2000 to 2100, and shows, first of all, where we are kind of under current policies. We're already emitting about 40 gigatons. What's that? 40,000 million tons of CO2 each year. And under current policies, that's going to continue to grow slightly. If we start to meet some of our treaty commitments, we'll bring that down a little bit. But these kind of pathways put us on to probably at least 3 degrees warming. In order to keep warming at 2 or 1.5, we are going to have to get on a trajectory by mid-century to really reduce those. and even go into negative emissions, starting to take CO2 back out of the air after mid-century. That's the physics of climate change. And to do that, not only are we going to have to do all those reductions across different economies, sectors of the economy, and decarbonize electricity and be more efficient, but the IPCC reports indicate that we are going to need carbon capture in various ways. First, to reduce emissions in industry and potentially the power sector where we can't switch to renewables or switch to electrification. Beyond that, we're actually going to have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. First of all, we need to do that because we're going to have to offset the effect of the residual CO2. We might still be burning jet fuel in 2050. Maybe that's the only way we can fly planes. So there might be some residual fossil fuel use we have to offset. We also have to offset the residual emissions of non-CO2 gases. I mentioned these: methane, nitrous oxide, F gases. It's very hard to figure out ways to take these to zero. So we're still going to have a good number of gigatons of those in 2050. We need to offset them by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The other thing, we could very likely overshoot safe levels. We might be at 3 degrees warming. We need to continue to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere by both kind of the forest and ag techniques, what I call the nature-based means, and also technological means. What do those look like? This is a graphic that sort of lays out our carbon dioxide removal options. What we call the nature-based ways highlighted here involve enhancing forests, planting trees, preserving trees, soil management techniques in agriculture. We know how to do this. These are ready now. They also have large co-benefits in terms of preserving biodiversity. But they're tough to do. Often we're working with multiple landholders. Some of them are very small farmers. It's hard to measure exactly what we're doing here. We can estimate, but most importantly, there's a risk of loss, particularly on forests. As I'm sure many of you know, some of our forests are going up in flames. So there may be nothing permanent about some of our forest storage of CO2. The other tool we have in the toolbox here is really under development. It's technology-based. It's things like literally running giant fans and moving air through a chemical processing facility and pulling the CO2 out, concentrating it, and pumping it into geologic storage areas. Some of that CO2 we could also perhaps use, enhanced oil recovery, I said, maybe mix it with cement, produce carbon fibers. These are probably niche uses. This will never be huge, but it'll help. There's also the idea of bioenergy with carbon capture, literally raising dedicated plants. They pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, combusting them for power production or industry, and capturing the CO2 and pumping it into geologic formations. These are all at the pilot or even the laboratory stage. But the important thing here to realize is that we are going to probably need to pull 5, 10, even 20 billion tons of CO2 out of the year, 20 gigatons potentially, by later in this century. And we will exceed the physical potential of doing this just with nature-based solutions. We need to develop the technologically based CDR methods that are just at the infant stage right now. There are dissenting views here. And if you want, the best example is a paper by the Center for International Environmental Law that says this doesn't work. It's too expensive. It's too risky. It prolongs dependence on fossil fuels, which is kind of posing a moral hazard question. We shouldn't do this because this could allow us to burn more fossil fuels. So I respectfully disagree, despite, you can get great guest essays in the New York Times and the MIT Technology Review saying don't do this. The mainstream view of climate experts is we need to develop this technology. Exactly how much we'll deploy it, we'll see. But not to develop it would be risky. Which brings me to my final metaphor. When we bet on climate solutions, should we place all of our chips on renewables and only nature-based carbon dioxide removals? No nukes, leave it in the ground. Should all this other stuff be off the table? I think that's a risky strategy for the planet. I think we should spread our chips over a broad portfolio of technologies. Some of them are going to pan out, some of them aren't. Some of them will hit economic obstacles, some of them will hit political public acceptance obstacles. We don't know yet, but let's spread our chips and make sure we have lots of tools to throw at this. So to sum up, how do we get there? Be efficient as possible across all end uses. Electrify everything we possibly can and make hydrogen and other low carbon fuels where we can't electrify. We need to double or triple electricity generation and convert it to all zero carbon. And finally, we need to commercialize carbon capture across a whole series of applications and deploy it in the decades ahead as needed. So I'll stop there. I look forward to, I can go back to certain graphics if you want, but look forward to additional questions and discussion.
Dr. Hausker, thank you for an amazingly erudite and balanced presentation. We have time for a few questions, and I'm just going to take advantage of the first one. Many of us followed the COP conference in Egypt and continue to be dismayed by the fact that China is let off relatively easily because it is deemed a developing country, even though it has the second largest GDP in the world and has an economy that is anywhere from 3 to 4 times larger than Germany or Japan. Is there anything we can do about this to help China carry its full weight?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my view, turn back the clock to 1997, the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. Large emitting developing countries like China and India were taking the position, we're not doing anything. We're not going to be part of a legally binding treaty that caps our emissions. That was, my gosh, 25 years ago. I'm happy to say that both China and India now have a greater realization that it is in their self-interest to be part of the solutions, and they are taking steps. The other thing that's happened at the international level is countries have pretty much given up on the notion that there's going to be a legally binding treaty. We're going to have in the 2015 Conference of the Parties at Paris, there was really a big framework shift to countries need to set their own targets on what they can do. Countries should pressure each other to set more ambitious targets, but the idea of somehow that the climate treaty is going to evolve into a world government that's going to force this country to do this or that, that was never really in the cards. So again, we could probably do a whole hour on China or large developing countries on their own, but they are taking steps. They're developing small modular reactors. They're developing solar and wind in a big way. They have said that they can peak out their emissions in the 2030s. That is their plan. They're realizing the health benefits in terms of air quality for their own citizens. So the good news is we have made progress on that front last 25 years.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have an online question, Joel?
Yeah, Mr. Erickson?
My apologies. Hey, I want to turn to a different piece of this equation, and that's geology. Specifically, all of the petroleum removal, fracking and whatnot has, for instance, in Oklahoma, all kinds of micro earthquakes and all kinds of subsidence and so forth. If we start pumping all this CO2 down into geological repositories, are we going to have like the whole earth kind of go boom, or are we going to have other geological issues come up with that particular process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not an expert in this, but I will tell you what I think from reading a little bit about this. First of all, yes, we have. It's absolutely true that we've experienced increased earthquake, typically minor earthquakes where we've done a lot of fracking and enhanced oil production. First of all, a lot of this, the CO2 is going to go even deeper into saline below saline aquifers, I believe, and it mingles and basically attaches to rocks. It's not like, don't think of it as a balloon that you sort of pump and the CO2 is like suddenly going to spurt out or something. It does eventually mineralize underground. Our National Academy of Sciences has sort of given it a clean bill of health that this can be done safely, but again, we should monitor closely. How deep do we have to go? What kind of formations minimize any chance of earthquakes?
You never, coal seems to be considered the dirtiest fuel. Is that always going to be so, or is it just that we haven't found the technology to clean it up yet?
Mm-hmm. Carbon capture technology can be placed on coal and oil and natural gas, industrial facilities and power production. Right now, the cost of carbon capture, particularly on coal plants, is still pretty high, both for retrofit. A coal plant is very high. Putting on a new coal plant is somewhat lower. We do have, there's probably going to be some demonstration projects to see if this is an option, but right now the economics look pretty bad compared to building out renewables and then complementing it with nuclear and gas and gas with carbon capture. But there's no technical reason why we couldn't be continuing to use some coal with carbon capture.
Any more online?
Yes, Ed Luckenbach.
Ed,
Yeah, hi. I'm surprised I don't see anything about genetic mutation of C4 and C3 chlorophyll. It seems that 5% of the vegetation of the world has C4 chlorophyll and accounts for 20% of the CO2 removal from the atmosphere. This is included in corn and rice and I think one tree in Hawaii. Why is there not an effort to try and get genetic mutation of C4 chlorophyll in trees and other vegetation?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like this could be a long-term sort of a solution with great potential.
I think I've read just a little bit about what you're talking about, and just to, if I understand it right, is that all plants draw some CO2 out of the atmosphere. Could we use genetic modification to enhance the ability of various plants to pull more CO2 out? I've heard of that as scientifically possible, but I just have read very little. I don't know what the potential is. There's probably some research going on it, but I simply can't say any more personally. Don't know anything.
okay. Recognizing the hard stop that Dr. Hausker has, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who has both a question and a formal thank you for his brother.
What did I tell you guys? I knew that my bro would step up for us. There is a certificate of appreciation, which I will get down to him sometime, Don. My question.
Thank you.
I've expected you to say at one point during your presentation 2 magic words. And I'd like to know why they seem to be off the table in these discussions. The 2 words are carbon tax.
I thought you were going to say one word, lifestyle changes, which is a whole another topic. Yeah, for literally decades, policy wonks and economists have said, a foundational policy to solve this problem should be some kind of carbon tax economy-wide. And, I'm sure many of us know the idea. You internalize an externality, you put the right economic incentive across the board for everyone to reduce in the least cost way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe in that. I believe in that theory as someone trained in economics and a card-carrying policy wonk. However, the politics have not supported the use of a significant carbon tax or carbon fee in any country or any jurisdiction. We have seen, cap and trade is working. That puts an implicit carbon price on, but you look at the history in the EU and it's never been a very high implicit carbon tax. China's experimenting a little bit with it. You have the RGGI greenhouse gas initiative that puts a little price on carbon on electricity, but wherever there have been efforts to put, strong carbon taxes on, they've been voted down in legislatures. They've failed on ballot initiatives. If you look at, or you look at the, the Yellow Jacket rebellion in France when they tried to raise gasoline taxes a lot. There's a lot of political opposition, despite economists saying this is a great policy tool. Maybe the politics will evolve or change over time, but I think I'm just factually describing, the last 30 years of the attempt to use carbon taxes, carbon fees, and really use the price mechanism like that. I can take
Again, thank you so much, Dr. Hausker, and I can, yes, and the old guard salute.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate the opportunity, and I'll send my deck to Eric and Paul. Feel free to send it to your members. Take care, everybody. Thanks.